Well, great study today in Ezekiel chapter 45. It's all about the coming of the kingdom. And we are seeing not only the allocation of land in that kingdom, but then also further instructions. I've told you earlier as we've come into this section that it's okay to skim. You don't have to be guilty about that or feel like you're doing something wrong. We're going to skim through these next chapters. I'm going to provide you a kind of a big picture view of what's happening here and reflect a little bit on why we see so much detail here. So let's just look at the outline for the chapter first of all. Again, I'd encourage you in the margin of your Bible to maybe lay out the outline to guide you through it as you read it. So in verses 1 through 8 of chapter 45, we see the Holy Land. Verses 9 through 12, we have instructions. 13 through 17, provisions. 18 through 25, a section about offerings. So a Holy Land, instruction, provision, and offerings is the outline for this chapter. It'll help you think through it, navigate your way through it. And first thing we're confronted with as we come to verse 1 is dividing the land. Now, God has promised a specific land to Israel. That promise is echoed throughout the Bible, beginning in Genesis chapter 12, verse 7, continues in Genesis 13, again in Genesis 17, I believe, 15. Continues really through the Bible. We find references to it in Deuteronomy, throughout the prophets, and here now in Isaiah or Ezekiel chapter 45. They're dividing the land for inheritance. This allocates this section here about an 8.5 by 3.3 mile rectangle of land. It's bordered on the north by Judah and the south by Benjamin. The eastern borders the Mediterranean Sea. So there's this basically a strip of land, and in the middle of that land will be a square mile for the temple. And within this area are rooms for the Levite and Zadokite priests. The prince himself also, you'll see in verse 7, the prince who was introduced in the last chapter has two allotments, one east and one west of the temple. So this is kind of the what I'd call the temple district, and this is laid out right at the beginning of this chapter in verses 1 through 8. When you drop down to verse 9, then we see this being instructions being developed here. And it might be surprising that the princes of Israel, this is the leaders of the tribe, not the prince that was introduced in chapter 44, but the princes, the leaders of Israel, are cautioned here. And I think they're being cautioned in light of what we have seen in Israel's previous kings and princes. They're being cautioned against the oppression of the people, expropriation of the people's land, using dishonest weights and measures to cheat the people. This is all a reflection of what has gone on before, and we know ourselves how power corrupts, and the Lord is cautioning them against that here. I think it also highlights what I've been speaking about before, is kind of the intermediate nature of this kingdom. There's still sin present. It's going to be quickly and decisively dealt with, but it's not eradicated during the millennial kingdom. It continues to exist until the eternal state. Verses 13 through 17 talk about provision here. This is the offering you shall make, and it lists what the people are to provide to the prince. And in verse 17 then, the prince in turn turns around and makes public sacrifices. And in these verses, you'll see that provision is made for burnt offerings, grain, drink, and peace offerings. Again, I've I've addressed before, and I'll just mention again here, people wonder why, in the light of the presence of the Messiah, we continue to have any kinds of offerings as well at all during the millennial kingdom. It's really perplexing for a lot of people. Let me just remind you that the offerings throughout the Bible were never salvific, never saved. The offerings themselves in the Old Testament during the dispensation of the law were there to point forward to Jesus' death on the cross. Today in the church, we have an ordinance called the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper points back to Jesus' death and points forward to his return. So in the Old Testament, under the Mosaic covenant, the sacrifices pointed forward. Today we have the Lord's Supper, which points backward to Jesus' death and forward to his coming. And during the millennial kingdom, we'll have sacrifices again that point backward to Jesus' sacrifice. It'll be a reminder of what he's done. As you read through this section, you'll drop down to verses 18 through 25. And this is talking about the offerings that are going to be made during that time of sacrifice. Verses 18 through 20 talk about preparation of the sanctuary, cleansing it. Verses 21 through 24 then address the Passover and burnt offering. And notice in verse 22, something I've mentioned before, is that the prince offers sacrifice for his own sin here. So I think it shows that the prince cannot be Jesus, who is the sinless Son of God, but some other person, some other administrator that's introduced at this time that operates for the Messiah. Verse 25 then talks about the Feast of Tabernacles, and interesting that this is going to continue into the millennial kingdom. You know, Zechariah talks about the Feast of Tabernacles at the end of his book, in Zechariah 14, talks about the nations will be coming up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. I think this is why Peter, when he beheld the glory of God, glory of Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, Peter was thinking the kingdom had arrived and it was time to build these tabernacles. But not so. The kingdom had not yet come. In fact, as late as Acts chapter 1, verse 11, after Jesus had been teaching his disciples privately on the earth for 40 days, we find that they're still anticipating the coming of the kingdom. And in Acts chapter 1, verse 11, the disciples ask him, hey, is it time now? Is it time for the kingdom? And Jesus says, no. So we still await for his kingdom. In terms of application of this chapter and really this section, you know, I'll just say for myself, maybe you as well, but I find myself kind of bewildered and at the same time comforted by the level of details in the prophecy about the temple. I find myself bewildered really because I find the details sometimes confusing. I have to go back over them again and try to understand and align them. It's kind of mind-numbing. I find my mind wandering away, and just the level of detail provided in these chapters. So that's why it's bewildering to me. Why would the Lord put these things in there? I'm sure he has good reason. But that brings me to the comfort. What comfort I take from this. I'm comforted because of the certainty of the fulfillment of every jot and tittle. That's what Jesus guaranteed in Matthew 5:17, that everything would be fulfilled down to the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. How wonderful I think it is to be serving and confident in a God who pays attention to detail like this. If he's paying attention to this kind of detail in the temple, imagine the detailed surveillance he has of our own lives to preserve us, to keep us. Jesus tells us that he is aware of even when a sparrow drops out of the sky, or the number of hairs on our head. I think it's bewildering to think that God has this level of detail in before him all the time, but also comforting for myself, and I hope, brothers and sisters, comforting for you that God pays attention. God bless you.